Can anybody hear me?
I can.
Shit. It's you. You are a stubborn bunch, aren't you? Well, tough luck. Guess you won't get me as long as I'm stuck here.
Cronos: The New Dawn is an original IP from Bloober Team, the people behind a number of well-received horror games, not least of which the Silent Hill 2 remake. It launched in late 2025 to mostly positive reviews and is currently sitting at a respectable strong 77 on OpenCritic. But here's the thing, while I think most of the criticism aimed at the game is fair, I also think it's way better than a lot of the review scores suggest. The common complaints were combat issues, steep difficulty spikes, an underwhelming narrative, and that it doesn't do enough to differentiate itself from the games that inspired it. Honestly, I don't disagree with most of those observations. Well, maybe excluding the part about the story, but I don't necessarily see them as negatives. I thoroughly enjoyed my recent playthrough, and while I recognise it won't be for everyone, I think it's a fantastic example of the genre and a must-play for survival horror fans. So there are a few things I want to focus on in this re-review. Why I think it's much better than a 6 or 7 out of 10, how it's changed since launch, and hopefully convincing you to give it a chance if you've been sitting on the fence.
Edward, did you get the...
Ah! Stay away! Stay away from me!
Compose yourself.
Please.
So something that seemed to be a common thread among the critics was that the story underdelivered. Many complained it was slow, convoluted, and full of plot holes, and that it didn't end in a satisfying way. Firstly, just in case you're about to click off, this video is completely spoiler-free. I've chosen not to show anything from the final chapter either, just so as not to reveal too much. But yeah, while I disagree that the story is dull or lacks a satisfying payoff, it isn't the easiest story to follow. To get the full picture, you really need to engage with the letters, notes, and recordings scattered throughout the game. A lot of the context surrounding certain characters, events, and motivations lives outside the cutscenes, so if you only follow the main story beats, you're going to miss out on quite a bit. Now, normally having to read a bunch of text logs makes me groan. Like, why the fuck is everyone in these universes documenting every thought they have with pen and paper? Here though, in the context of the 80s and a pandemic lockdown, it makes a lot more sense. Most of the optional storytelling is concise too, and the text is presented in a clear, easy to read font, which definitely helps. As for plot holes or things that don't quite add up, I think any story dealing with multiple timelines and big existential questions is always going to run that risk. And sure, if you go looking for them, I'm guessing you can find a few here. Overall though, I found the story interesting, it has a couple of genuinely good surprises, and it does a great job of making what is essentially another zombie outbreak narrative feel fresh. Considering we've been consuming variations of that story for decades at this point, that's no small achievement. It's true that the central characters are pretty stoic, but there's a compelling mystery surrounding who they are and what their involvement in the outbreak, or the change as it's referred to, actually is. And piecing it together kept me thoroughly engaged for the 20 hours it took me to finish the game. I also think that the ending is pretty clever in the way that it encourages you to jump straight into a New Game Plus. I can't say much more without wandering deep into spoiler territory, but finding a way to contextualize New Game Plus as part of the story was a brilliant idea. So there are 3 endings as far as I'm aware, and the only way to get the true ending is by completing a New Game Plus. And I love that you can change the difficulty in the New Game Plus too. It's unclear how many critics played through it more than once, but given they're often under strict delivery timeframes, it's probably safe to assume that most of them didn't roll credits twice. I do wonder if they had, if there would be less comments about the ending lacking closure.
How did you get here anyway? It probably wasn't easy to get, was it?
Okay, so now I want to talk about gameplay, because most of the criticism centered around how it plays. A lot of the reviewers said that the gunplay and enemy encounters were repetitive or felt generic. I agree that it does little to innovate or introduce anything that feels fundamentally different to the titles that served as inspiration, but repetitive is not how I would describe the combat. I think it has a really good cadence of new weapon unlocks, upgrades, and how the game introduces enemies. It regularly mixes things up with elements in the environment you can use during combat or how many enemies you fight at once. I do agree that most of the boss battles are a bit repetitive. They're not exactly the same, but the strategy for dealing with them essentially boils down to finding the explosive barrels and canisters in each stage, setting the boss on fire, and then shooting the glowing weak points. The other common complaint about the combat is that it has some pretty significant difficulty spikes. With the exception of the final challenge, which I'll admit is a real doozy, I don't entirely agree. I'd argue that they're more like skill checks than actual spikes in difficulty. The game is constantly testing whether you've understood the mechanics it's been teaching you. If you've been relying on the same strategy for every encounter, you'll eventually hit a point where that approach stops being as effective. What can feel like a sudden increase in difficulty is often just the game introducing a new variable that forces you to adapt and rethink how you're approaching combat. Unsurprisingly, it rewards experimentation. Later in the game, you get the conductor that lets you connect power sources to devices, but you can use this to do a number of other things, such as opening crates, detonating flammable canisters, and even taking out the exploding pus babies. I actually don't know what this enemy is called. You're never explicitly told that you can do this, and this one ability gives you many more options and can save you a ton of ammo. Avoiding enemies can be an option too. You don't have to kill everything, and sometimes it's better to save your resources than it is to try and clear a room. There are situations where you absolutely do have to clear the room, but it's always obvious when that's the case. I think how you choose to upgrade your kit is the key here. Upgrading weapon performance is important so that you can be faster, more accurate, and deal more damage, but upgrading your inventory, I'd argue, is even more critical. Being able to hold more than a single flame unit or proximity mine gives you many more options during combat, especially because setting enemies on fire momentarily stuns them, making the all-important headshots easier, and there's a perk that lets you deal extra damage to burning enemies. So yeah, I think the most important component of the gameplay is the inventory management, and it's a big reason why I enjoyed the game so much. Interestingly, this was another common criticism, which I find a little odd because limited inventory space is one of the foundations of the survival horror genre. Deciding what to bring with you and making difficult choices about what to keep and what to leave behind is not only rewarding, it helps to make each player's experience feel unique. While you can equip up to 4 weapons at once, that isn't necessarily the best approach. Even with a heavily upgraded inventory, you'll struggle to carry enough ammunition for every weapon while still leaving room for health items and key resources. If you treat the game like Dead Space and lean too far into the action side of things, you'll quickly run out of space and find yourself lacking the tools you need to survive. Early on, I prioritized inventory upgrades, particularly additional slots and the ability to stack duplicate items, and it paid dividends. Having permanent room for tools that unlock new areas, while still carrying ammo, healing items, and valuables, felt far more useful to me than increasing my maximum health or weapon damage. A small inventory means you'll be relying heavily on the storage boxes, which inevitably leads to a lot of backtracking. Even with 12 inventory slots, there were still moments where I had to get creative, or even abandon something valuable to make room for an item I couldn't do without. So while I personally love that aspect of the game, I can understand why some found it frustrating. Look, I recognize that a lot of what I've said probably sounds like, well, you just didn't know how to play the game properly, idiot. And that's a fair call because I kind of am saying that, but I also think that's one of the game's biggest weaknesses. It isn't particularly good at encouraging experimentation or helping players discover where the fun is. I gravitated towards things like the inventory management and the nuances of combat because that's the sort of stuff I enjoy, but if I hadn't engaged with those systems, I probably would have come away frustrated with the combat too. I think a lot of the game's strengths only really reveal themselves once you've started experimenting, and I don't think Cronos does enough to push players in that direction. Okay, so the game has received a number of updates since launch, but almost all of them address performance, bugs, or quality of life issues. It doesn't look like difficulty, combat, or the inventory system has changed in any significant way since launch. There are a couple of outliers though. A new easy mode called the Temporal Driver mode was added, and this reduces enemy difficulty and boosts player health. So if you're just in it for the vibes and the story, this is a welcome addition for those who might have been put off by the challenge. The other notable change is, shortly after launching, Bloober Team released a native Linux build for the Steam Deck that provides better performance on the handheld. I personally think this is a big screen type of game, but it's certainly nice to have options. I think the biggest criticism levelled at Cronos the New Dawn is that it's derivative, or to put a more positive spin on it, it wears its influences on its sleeve. The combat, crafting, and upgrade systems feel like the love child of Dead Space and Resident Evil, with a sprinkling of The Last of Us and maybe a hint of Stranger Things thrown in for good measure. While I understand the criticism that it doesn't do anything particularly new from a gameplay perspective, I think it strikes a really strong balance between combat, exploration, and storytelling. I guess the only thing I found disappointing was the lack of puzzles. There's really only one standout puzzle in the entire game, which feels like a missed opportunity given the setting and the genre. Now, I don't think adding an easy mode ruins the experience. This is a story-driven, atmospheric game, and you can absolutely enjoy those aspects without engaging in the more challenging combat. That said, I do think you lose some of the game's most tense moments. More importantly, inventory management becomes far less important, and you lose a lot of the decision making that makes the combat so engaging. Overall, Cronos the New Dawn is one of the most polished and entertaining AA games I've ever played. The premise, characters, and world are genuinely fascinating, and Bloober Team have created a strong foundation to build on if they choose to revisit this universe. There's so much potential for more stories here, and hopefully those leaks about the upcoming DLC are true. This is easily the best game I've played this year so far.